Well, welcome back if you've been away. And if you remained in your chair throughout the break, now's the time to do some in-chair exercises to avoid deep vein thrombosis. You really should have got up and gone for a walk. That's my personal advice as a fitness guru. So, our next session is all about native advertising. We've got some really excellent speakers. And our first is from the Native Advertising Institute in Denmark. Please welcome its CEO, Jesper Laursen.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. So I am here to tell you about the latest research that we did together with FIPP. So it's about native advertising in the magazine industry. It's the second year in a row. I've only got 20 minutes to show you numbers, so I'm a little busy. Also because this seems to be the widest stage I've ever been on. So if I have to get from one end to the other, 20 minutes will probably not do. So let's dive into this. I'm going to go through three parts of the survey that we did. The first one is the magazine publishers' attitude towards native advertising. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about the sales and services of the publishers. And then finally, we're going to be touching on the budgets. So those are the three things. Now, before we dive in, just a quick word about ourselves. We are the Native Advertising Institute, and we're the world's premier think tank on native advertising. So we publish, of course, a blog with hundreds of articles. We have the Native Advertising Awards. We publish research like the one I'm about to show you now. We host the biggest event on native advertising in Berlin every year. So we have different activities on native advertising. All right, so just a few facts about the research that we did. First off, it was a collaboration between FIPP and ourselves at the Native Advertising Institute. It's the second edition, so we had the first one last year. We had the data collection June through August this year, and there was 207 respondents from 53 countries. So it was truly a global, or is truly a global survey. Also, it was both editorial and commercial executives. And then finally, the report will be published next week. It's not 100% done yet, which is why you might see a rounding error or two in there, but nothing big. All right, so let's dive in first on the attitude towards native advertising. We asked the publishers, how important is native advertising to your company? And that's actually the first rounding error. It should be 46. 46% of the publishers are finding native advertising very important, and another 45% are seeing native advertising as important to them. We also asked them, so what are your feelings towards native advertising? And 80% are having positive feelings toward native advertising, and only 3% are feeling negatively about it. Now, last year's survey, 72% were feeling positive about it, and 9% were having negative feelings about it. We are seeing a little more pushback on the editorial side than on the commercial side, maybe not surprisingly, but a couple of months back, we had a seminar, one-day seminar in Copenhagen. It was put on by a big publisher, the country's biggest publisher. And during the day, a lot of the editorial staff kind of dropped in. They weren't invited, but they kind of dropped in. And there were even a couple of the chief editors that complained afterwards that they weren't invited to the native advertising event. So even though it is more popular amongst the commercial sites, we are seeing that an adaptation amongst the editorial sites as well. All right. So we asked the publishers, how likely are you to use native advertising as an advertising or service option? 54% already does offer native advertising. Last year, that was 52%. So not a massive growth, but a growth. And if you look at the 8% that this year is not likely or less likely to offer it, last year that number was 11%. So we're seeing more adopting this and offering this, and we're seeing less that are hesitant in doing so. All right, so let's touch on the sales and services side. So what it is that they're actually offering and how they sell this. First off, we asked them, how do you provide native advertising solutions? And surprisingly, well, 65% of the publishers will actually let you use their normal journalists. Now, I usually, when I talk to CEOs of publishers, they all seem to say that you can't at their company, but at least 65% of the times you'll actually use their normal journalists. Last year, that number was 68%. So at our conference last year, we talked to Pete Wooden from Dennis Publishing about this specific thing, because they are a company that will let you use their normal journalists. I'm just going to play a quick video clip for you.
You get it right, for me, by making sure that your normal editorial team work on the content. So I know it's quite controversial, and I know there's this idea of sort of church and state for a lot of publishers, where they try and keep it separate between the commercial editorial team and the normal editorial team. But for us, I think that particularly in the vertical markets we work in, the way to produce the best possible quality content, compelling content that resonates for a target audience, is to get the people who normally write this stuff to do it for the commercial teams as well. And if you get that right, that means that it's shared socially, that it's compelling, and it means that it works. It hits the KPIs for the advertiser.
So you can use the Pete's journalist for this. Now, most of the people that are saying that you can't, that there needs to be a very clear division between church and states, are usually saying that either the publication in itself will be too dependent on the brand. But Pete's point is that, well, we already are. I mean, even if we're not helping them, we are still getting their advertising revenue, so we're still depending on it. And the other pushback is that the specific journalist will then become dependent on that brand. But I mean, especially in the news media industry, all the people that are testing cars, for example, apparently that can't happen in London. That needs to happen in the Bahamas or somewhere. And you can't, like most of the, the travel section is written by journalists that are on a journey paid for by the travel agents. So there are many different gray areas already, which is one of Pete's reasons for letting you use his journalists. Okay, so another one, the next one is that 30% has their own native ad studio. So this is actually probably one of the biggest now. I heard that the panel was talking a little bit about the revenues that you can actually make in terms of this. But we are seeing a lot of publishers having their own in-house studios. Some publishers will not let you be in their publication unless they are doing it. Now, of course, that will generate revenues for them, but the other point is that if it has to be true native, so native to that specific publication, it needs to be done by people who really knows that publication. If we look at what it is that they're offering these, I mean, be it their editorial team or a studio that they're using. So the number one with 92% is written content. The second one is video content with 63, and then comes multi-platform storytelling, layout. And then the fifth one is interesting. That's events and experience, which is normally not what you'd consider advertising. But a quick example is that this. So this was they actually won the gold medal at the Native Advertising Awards last year, but it was a project done by for Adidas, and it ran in four Nordic countries. But it was a native ad campaign that had a little bit of native going on L's platform, but the main thing for the campaign was actually a run for women. And it was an influencer advertising campaign, if you will, where they were using influencers to drive awareness and to drive women to this event. But the very bulk of the whole campaign was at the physical event. So that's just one example. But it ties into something that we're seeing publishers diving more and more into, is spreading out well beyond their own platforms. So another example here is one done by CNN for Nippon Airways, the Japanese airline. It was a very, very beautiful crafted videos that ran, of course, on CNN's platform, but a very significant part of that program was actually programmatic reach through share-through. And that was done by CNN. So Nippon Airways bought the entire campaign, including a very big percentage of programmatic use through share-through on different platforms, other platforms, obviously, than CNN's own. And CNN did everything in that campaign. So that's another example of someone reaching beyond their own platforms. Another example is from the biggest Croatian publisher, Sata24. This was a project they did exclusively on YouTube. So it didn't have any reach at all on the publisher's own platforms, but it only lived on YouTube. But again, this was done for Coca-Cola. but Coca-Cola came to them and it ended up with a campaign that didn't happen on their platforms at all, but happened anywhere else. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should not run on your own platforms, obviously. There's good money to be made, but it's just to say that if you're going into this, there are massive opportunities at the moment. So the panel had a small discussion on whether brands can actually create great content or not. Some can, absolutely. Some can't. But the fact of the matter is that publishers can absolutely create great content that would work for a brand on every kind of platform, because publishers like yourselves are already working on those platforms, so not only on your own. So big opportunities there. We also asked the publishers, how do you sell your native advertising solution? So 34% sells it as a separate product, whereas 66% sells it only in combination with traditional advertising. Last year, 24% was sold as a separate product. So we're seeing a slide towards it being an add-on. So if you run a normal advertising campaign, maybe you should add a little bit of native, and turning it into actual much more standalone campaigns that are only focused on native advertising. Another example is, do you have a dedicated sales team for native advertising? 89% does not have that. 11% has a dedicated team. Last year, 14% of the surveyed publishers had a dedicated sales team for native advertising. What we're seeing right now is very, very different ways of selling. Now, some publishers are actually hiring content people to do the selling. And what the point is that it is content that you're selling. So you need to convince them. You need to create and craft content strategies for that brand. And nobody's better at explaining and selling that than content people. So that's in one end of the spectrum. We're seeing a lot of constellations where they're just bringing the content people to the sales process. And of course, in the other end, we're seeing publishers that just have normal salespeople selling this. Anyways, so that's for the selling part. So for the last section, let's just touch on the budgets. I could do that in one easy slide, because this is basically what's going on with the budgets at the moment. What we're seeing is that we asked them, so of your overall advertising revenues, what percentage do you expect will be from native advertising in 2017 as opposed to, compared to 2016? 81% expects to get more this year than last year, and only 1%, that should actually be 2%, are expecting their advertising revenues to be less than last year. So we also asked them, of your overall advertising revenue, what percentage will come from native advertising? What came from native advertising in 2016? And that was on average 21%, fairly consistent, but on average 21%. And then we asked them, how much of your advertising revenues are you expecting to get in 2020? And that number is as high as 40 on average. So those are very big numbers. Now, you might think this is wishful thinking, but we are surveying, we're making different kinds of surveys. So we've done one for the media agencies. Right now, we're doing one, a brand survey. We just finished it in Denmark, a couple of other countries. We're doing it right now in Germany. And it's pretty much the same picture. So in terms of the brands, the survey is not completely done yet, but the numbers right now are showing that in 2015, they were spending 10% of their total marketing budgets on native advertising. This year, they're spending 20%, and they're anticipating spending 29% of their total marketing budget on native advertising by 2020. So that pretty much aligns with these numbers. And then another funny thing, so this is a slide from last year's presentation. We asked the publishers what percentage of native advertising revenues will come from print, or what percentage came from print in 2015, and that number was 42. And so how much do you expect in 2018? And that number was 38. But in this year's survey, it turns out that print was accounting for 32% of the total native advertising revenues. So we're seeing the percentage or the share for print native advertising declining much quicker than publishers was anticipating last year. All right, So I'm 46 seconds away from being done. One last slide. There are much more to be had at the, of course, in the report. You can download it from our website, nativeadvertisinginstitute.com, next week. Sign up for a newsletter and you'll get a notification when it's done. One last thing, though, is we asked them, how do you label native advertising? So there are much more ways than this. There are like, I don't know, 25 different ways of doing that. But the interesting thing is down here. 10% of the publishers globally do not label native advertising at all. Now, I don't hope that I need to tell you that that's illegal, you know. So that's one reason not to do it. Another reason is obviously that being a legacy media, having built your relationship with your readers over decades or sometimes maybe over a century, you can very, very quickly ruin that relationship and that trust that you've built within your audience. And sadly, the 10% is across the world. So I'm not 100% certain of this year's. We haven't crunched the numbers yet, but last year, 50% of those, that was actually 11% that didn't label it last year, but 50% of those came from Europe, 30% came from the States, and the rest came from the rest of the world. So we're still seeing in 10% of the cases. Now, another thing is that if a publisher is aiming for long-term success with native advertising, you need to get good at strategizing. You need to get good at helping brands achieve their business goals. Now, if it's not labeled and if they're a secret, it's going to be much harder to actually create a strategy that will help the brand monetize the native advertising campaign. So the authorities don't want you to cheat. You shouldn't want to cheat your readers. The readers certainly don't want to be cheated, but actually the brands, the advertisers don't want it either. And fact of the matter is that people will read and watch native advertising if it's just as engaging and just as good as relevant as the content that's usually in the publication. So that was the final slide that I was going to show you. We have native advertising days next month in Berlin. Because we have a collaboration with FIPP, we're offering a 35% discount if you or one of your colleagues use this promotion code once you're done. And other than that, thank you very much.
Jesper, thank you, and I'm guessing you're around for the during the lunch break if people want to catch up with you and ask any further questions. That's great. Thank you.